Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, a podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there and how you might use those features or ideas and how you might apply them in your environments. This is episode 71, and I'm Steve Stedman.
And I am Carlos El Chacon. Today on a program, we're going to be talking about BI tools or tools of the trade for analytics. Our guest today is Kevin Wilkie, and he is the BI analyst for Innovative Architects just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. I got to know Kevin through some of the SQL Saturdays in the community. And so through those associations, I've gotten to know him and wanted to have him on the program to talk a little bit about that. And I think just maybe how uncomplicated the tools can be when we start talking about analytics, particularly I think in the beginning phases.
Sure, analytics doesn't have to be complex.
Exactly. And so he kind of gives his take and some of his experiences. And again, because he's one of those that has to wear a lot of hats, I thought he'd be a good person to bring in and again, get some of that experience.
Okay, great. So that brings me to just a short story. A few weeks ago, I was at Past Summit and I ran into a friend and we got talking about database corruption, which is one of those things that I work on quite a bit. And that's actually what I was presenting on at Past Summit. And this is somebody I'd known for a few years. And he was telling me a story about how he ran into corruption and how they had to lose some data to get their data back. So I said, well, why didn't you call me? I would have helped you out. And he didn't realize that that was one of the services that we offer. So I just want to point out at this point that that's one of those things that I do or that we offer through SQL Data Partners is help with fixing database corruption. And it's one of those things that's usually kind of an emergency response where someone calls us to do their stuff we're working on and help get that straightened out and get it fixed. And the goal there is to get it fixed without losing any data. And there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different methods that we have to do that.
That's right. And I think you have a fairly impressive track record. At least I'm impressed by it, Steve. So that ability to not be able to lose any data, I think, is key. I think one of those things about corruption is that while everyone will experience it at some point, it's not something that comes up every day. And so if you're not kind of staying up with it, and it can manifest itself in many different ways. And so even having someone to bring in, bounce questions off of, or, okay, here's our plan of attack. What do you think? Those types of things are also things that we can help you with.
Yep. And that's the kind of thing that I've helped with and we can help with at SQL Data Partners is everything with corruption from just bouncing ideas off us to say, this is what I'm planning on doing. What do you think? All the way to here's our corrupt database. Fix it for us. And anything in between database, fix it for us. And anything in between.
Bring my data back.
Yep.
That's right. We do want to give a shout out. In episode 69, we had our SQL Server setup session, and we put out our checklist and asked for some feedback on what we were doing, what people thought. And thanks to everyone who has given some of that feedback or asked questions about that. Of course, our checklist is available at sqldatapartners.com/server setup. It was mentioned a couple of things, not quite everything that we do in our setup is in the podcast, but the checklist is a little more comprehensive. Of course, that continues to get changed and added to. And as people start to look at that or have more questions about it, that will be something that will be a living document, if you will, that we'll move forward with. So thanks to everybody who chipped in there and gave their feedback. And if you haven't done so, you're welcome to go back to that episode and do that as well. That's one of the things that I really like about is a good example of some of the types of conversations we like to have. Ultimately, as administrators, we might be siloed just a little bit, and listeners might think that they're alone in some of the pains that they're going through with database administration. Ultimately, what we'd like to do is to be able to talk about different scenarios, how people are tackling different things and different pain points. And while we do get a lot of information from the marketing folks as to what tools we should be using and how, much better our lives would be if we just bought this stuff. And in certain cases, the right tool does make a huge difference. There's no question. Ultimately, this idea of sharing and discussing how you resolve different pain points is what I've really grown to enjoy about doing this podcast, because it's not always easy putting it together. And so kind of getting some of that interaction and folks willing to share their stories is something that I look forward to and continues to help me move on. Which, I guess I should say, Steve, we are now the longest running podcast for SQL Server, to my knowledge.
With
this
71 episodes?
71 episodes, right?
Wow.
So there were a few that started before us, obviously. Due to scheduling, we know it's hard. Obviously, doing it weekly is a constant battle. But now that we have 71 episodes, that's kind of another little milestone, if you will. And so thank you to everyone who has provided some support, even if it's a tweet, a like, comment, meeting us at events at Summit or at SQL Saturdays. Ultimately, those interactions, again, help keep this podcast alive, and to know that people are out there enjoying this content. We do appreciate it.
Yep. And I think that's really what keeps us going on this, is when we get that feedback, or when we see how many people are listening or all that. That's the kind of thing that the more listeners or all that, that's the kind of thing that the more listeners we have and the more feedback we get, the more episodes we'll do. That's
exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, so let's go ahead and get into the conversation with Kevin. Compañeros, thanks again for tuning in, and welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Okay, well, Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Carlos.
Yeah, thanks for coming on with us today. So compañeros, for those of you on the East Coast, you might have run into Kevin. He's just outside the Atlanta area, and been a big, I'll say, supporter of the show, particularly kind of early on. Getting some supportive feedback from Kevin was helpful to me, and so I appreciate now that we're able to have him on and talk a little bit with him about some of the things. And I appreciate now that we're able to have him on and talk a little bit with him about some of the things that he's doing. And ultimately, I think our idea today, or our focus, is going to be that the analytics environments have started to take over more and more of the attention that the data world is getting, and so lots of focus is being placed there. And I think as administrators, we want to be able to start looking there. How do we potentially move over into the analytics world, and what tools are those analytics folks using? And so ultimately, I think that's where we're going to be. That's where our focus is tools for analytics, how and when to appropriately apply them. So we talk about, these tools, and ultimately we're talking about the Microsoft stack, right? And these are going to be tools that you've heard of and probably installed before. And so I guess let's just go ahead and start that conversation, Kevin. Why don't you talk about some of these tools that you're using for data analysis?
Thank you, Carlos. I think one of my favorite tools, since I've been doing SQL for years, is SQL itself. I get into the actual SQL itself to play with the database and write simple queries just so I can see the overall form of the database, of many of the tables. Don't get really into the nitty-gritty as much. I try not to in SQL Server itself, but I like to at least see the overall form. You can at least see things like the foreign keys, the primary keys, any constraints that the table will have. Kind of where the data will lie. That's where I try to stay just at that level with SQL Server itself and for data analysis anyway. If I want to go a little above there, I'll work with SSIS, one of my favorite tools. I'll use the data profiling test, how many nulls there are in the tables, how many overall distinct values there are, how far the table, the field exists in the table, like what the min and max are, things like that.
So I think maybe let's just step back just for a moment and talk about, so we were talking about analytics. You mentioned like you like to spend your time in SQL Server. And I think most people would say that is true. Ultimately, when we need to start looking at tools is because we have either questions that we want to ask the data that we can't get currently, or we want to look at the data in a different way or present that to other people so that they can review it and ask questions of that data, right? So it's interesting. So you went from the SQL Server and then kind of into SSIS, but you used that as more of, instead of an ETL, it almost sounds like a data, right? Rather of an ETL, it almost sounds like a data cleansing or a data integrity operation, right? Rather than moving it from one place to the other.
In this case, you're right. It is just, and for this one task, SSIS is fairly good at just, like the task itself says, it's profiling. You're just seeing the basic outlines of how far it can go from min and max, maybe a few averages and standard deviations, but not overly heavy on what you can do with it and not how much you can see with it. But you can see, especially the big thing I see is how many nulls are in the table. Because if you have a 400,000 row table and 398,000 are nulls, usually the business needs to know that, or we need to rethink why that field exists in the table.
Sure. Yeah, there's not enough data there to validate or to use enough data there to validate or to use that as a valid option.
So just a question around that, Kevin. I know the data profiling task in SSIS that you mentioned, that's not something that I have myself used in the past, but the things you're describing there are things that I would normally have done in SQL Server and T-SQL. And I'm just curious, what are the benefits of getting at that with the data profiling task rather than just writing queries to do it?
Because with the data profiling task, I can do it a little bit faster, and I don't have to do as much work to actually see for each. Let me back up. For example, if I want to do the min, max, standard deviations, and averages, I have to do a little bit of work on a number for each field. I have to write different equations for SQL. Whereas
Okay.
data profiling task, I can do it in one shot.
Okay, that makes sense. So that sounds like
You mentioned being able to touch SQL Server and then also be able to use SSIS. Now, generally, while that line is getting thinner and thinner, there has traditionally kind of been a border between the administrators or the keepers of the data and then what we're going to allow them users access to. Now, and when we think analytics, we're talking about end users. I mean, I guess there are the Power BI folks that we see in the community, but generally we're thinking of our business users. Any heartache with giving them access to SSIS, or is that something kind of more purely for the administrator and kind of a prep move?
It's really a tool I use when I'm setting up or doing the beginning phases of a warehouse. I wouldn't like to give a normal user access, because there obviously are multiple tools that the SSIS world can do, and even SQL sometimes will intimidate the normal user too much that he'll just throw up his hands and run away.
Sure.
So I like to keep these two tools for really the IT use. If you can't really know what you're doing, these two tools are great, but for the normal everyday user, not so much.
Okay.
Okay, so then if you're considering SSIS and then T-SQL and SQL Server for like the IT side of things, and then the normal users come along and they want to be able to go and do some analysis, what are you recommending, or how are you going about doing that with other tools?
Well, there are two branches of users, I like to call it. The more advanced users, I would have in like Power BI, Tableau, something that there's a lot of features, almost IT, but not quite. They can do, IT can still have security on it, so they can make sure they're not going crazy and adding a bunch of stuff that they shouldn't be, or even looking at data they shouldn't be. Where in both of those worlds, you can still do 98% of everything you'll ever want, at least for the power users, but also the second class of users, and we'll mix in with power users, because I like to give them a tool that they really know rather well. It's Excel.
Oh boy, we're going to have to wash your mouth out with soap now, Kevin.
So
Yeah,
Excel's that tool that's sort of magically hiding in front of one.
Yeah, but it has a lot of features that everybody has gotten used to and everybody can play with. But the sad thing is everybody likes to think they're a expert at it. So with some of these tools, you really, really do have to know what you're doing, but at least you're in Excel, so you'll and you can play around some other ways and still get the same data, but there are a lot of easier ways. Even VLOOKUP for some people is advanced, and you can find a lot of things just doing straight VLOOKUP.
Well, so now it's interesting. I think one of the things that maybe we scoff a little bit with Excel is that when we think about SQL Server, we tend to think about processes, set-based operation, performance, automation, right? Think about Excel, I don't think about any of those things in that term. So I guess maybe can you give us some thoughts, or under what circumstances should we be using Excel versus all these automated things that we like to be using?
I like to use Excel for more a proof of concept, to actually see, oh, yeah, we can do this. Does this make more sense this way? If I have only like 20,000 rows, Excel is great for that.
Sure.
Especially if it's already in a spreadsheet, and let's face it, 99.9% of our stuff is spreadsheets. Why do you take it out of Excel, put it in SQL Server, massage it a little bit, and then run through with it? Let's just go ahead and do what we need to in Excel. That's what people want. Let's give it to them in Excel.
You know, one area I do think that we could probably be users, those Excel users, and that is in that data validation, parts, right? Because the business users are coming to us with these reports that they want written. They're going to be showing us that data in Excel, and I think we could potentially help leverage that to say, okay, well, look, this is the process that I went through. Let's validate that this is, I guess, maybe before I build it, let's validate that process with them, right? I take this data, I do this to it, I apply this, and then I add that, this special sauce, and bam, there's my number. And I think that could potentially help accelerate that report development process.
Right. Well, heck, even Excel itself can do a lot of what-if scenarios. It can do the t-test. It can do a lot of ANOVA tests that the more of the data analysis sites will use. You can do all your tests there without having to go to R or Python or will use. You can do all your tests there without having to go to R or Python or whatever your flavor of choice is.
So when you're talking about Excel for data analysis at that point, do you find that the Excel Solver tool is being used quite a bit for that?
I've used Solver not as much as I use the data analysis itself.
Okay.
And for those who don't know, both data analysis and Solver are just very simple add-ins that are simple Microsoft Excel add-ons. They're almost loaded straight out from when you loaded Excel, but you have to do like one or two clicks, and they're there.
Right. So, for instance, I've seen the solver used in data analysis to sort of run the what-if scenarios where it has to work through a number of variables and figure out, well, what if we adjusted this in this way or in that way? And I've seen, like, different times trying to port that same kind of thing into SQL Server, that could be very challenging.
Yeah, it's not simple because Excel is made for statistics and numbers. It's made if this variable changes and this variable changes and this variable changes, what's the one I can get the most out of this other number? Solver is great for that. How you do that in SQL? It will take a little while to figure that one out because it changes on each scenario.
Yep. Okay, so then, as we go through this, we talk about the different tools, and we've mentioned SSIS and Excel and SQL, and what else do you see being used for this analysis side of things?
Well, we've started to use SSRS, especially the new SSRS 2016, since it has the great mapping capabilities that more and more of our clients are starting to really like because they're not just seeing the data that's actually in their little area. They're big companies that want to do more and more stuff outside of Georgia, the South, United States, and we'll do stuff all over the world. So it's great so they can see how is their product being bought in Atlanta, in Richmond, in Seattle, wherever. They can do all kinds of analysis, even down to at least the city level. I'm sure some of these people have done it even further down than that.
So what kind of a learning curve? Now, I guess you have the advantage in that you are in the architect role, or at least that's one of those hats that you wear. But how much of a learning curve is it? So, building SSIS reports, particularly ones that come from stored procedures, I think are kind of the very, I won't say basic, but that's like a lot of people cut their teeth on those kinds of scenarios, right? So now going to a report, as you mentioned, that includes the geography components, what kind of learning curve is involved there?
For SSRS, at least for me, there wasn't a huge amount because for the most part, once you have the city, because most of the data will have city, state, zip, at worst, most of our stuff will have that data in it.
Mm-hmm.
You're good. Thankfully, SSRS picks it up and runs with it.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's really just like, I'd like this type of map. Here are my columns, and there you go. I can see the data.
Yep, because it's all built in and going through Bing. It's great for that.
Gotcha.
So it's basically using Bing as your presentation engine wrapped in SSRS?
Yes, that's exactly what it does. It's, at least from what I've been able to tell, it is using Bing to just throw the data out there, and it figures it out. Oh, this is where Atlanta is. This is where Richmond is. This is where the counties around it are. Able to figure it out rather quickly.
I have a tool that I've heard talked a lot about, and I've heard scenarios, but I haven't. It seems like only in very niche situations or with people that really know their stuff have been able to get master data services to work well. Am I off base there, or why is there not more adoption of master data services?
I wish I could tell you. Well, I think there's a couple of things going on with master data services that makes it where people don't want to use it as much. First part is, it can be highly taxing on the actual business user themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because somebody has to be on it every day making sure, yes, this one is a real valid answer. Let's put it into our data warehouse. No, this one is a real valid answer. Let's put it into our data warehouse. No, this one really means this. And these are the people that are the SMEs who actually know what the data itself is. You can't have a janitor fixing everyday data. You have to have somebody that knows what they're doing. So that's a big major problem. You have to know the data, or else this is worthless. The other thing is, I don't think we're actually pushing it as much as we should be, because with the small 10, 15 people shop, there's really not a big use for this. I wouldn't think. There are probably scenarios where, yes, it'd be great, but for the big major companies and some of the groups that are within it, it could be useful, but I don't think that the people that are as much as it should be.
Okay. And so, Compañeros, I just want to ask a question to all of you. Would you be interested in hearing more about master data services? Again, I've talked with lots of people that are mostly product managers. So if you're interested in us doing an episode on that, let me know. I've kind of shied away from it just because, again, it kind of seems like you really have to spend quite a bit of time to get up to speed on it. But if it's something you think we should cover, let us know. Hashtag SQL Podcast.
What's interesting on that one is that with master data services, it seems like there's two categories of people I've seen. There's the people who swear by it and it's the best thing they've ever used, and there's the people who swear at it, and it's the most painful thing that they've ever used. So maybe it's that there's some misunderstanding there, but I think that there's certainly a lot of value there that people could, if you have to do the data cleansing side of things, that you could get with that.
Yeah,
I agree. It's been available for a rather long time. more and more people should be at least heard of it, like it enough to at least try it, but it's just not happening for whatever reason.
And I think some of that, it needs to maybe get a little bit more love from Microsoft, which from an interface perspective still feels a little bit formish, and I think that may be part of it as well.
Now, Carlos, you're not talking about the extremely early versions of it. It was, I agree, completely bad. 2008 R2 was horrible. 2012 was a little better. I think I haven't seen the 2016 version of it, but I believe they've updated it some.
Okay, yeah, I admit I haven't looked at 2016. I've heard that they've been doing some updating, but I haven't seen any screenshots.
Yeah.
Okay, so
my wife is going to well, so.
Yeah. So I guess last thoughts. I mean, we've had on this show, we've also from the Atlanta area on earlier talking about Power BI, and of course that continues to change. I guess thoughts about introducing that or making that part of the repertoire of analytics?
I think just like everything else, you have to play with it. You have to work it in. Once you see how, I don't want to say life-shattering, but it can really help your world by using Power BI or all the tools that are available, especially even MDS, just to see if it's available. Test it, play with it, see if it works for you. Some of these things just won't, but others will, and you'll see it's much easier once you actually start playing with it and know what you can do with each of these tools. That's what I'm encouraging. Just try some of these things. Try different scenarios. See what this works. See what works. See what doesn't.
And I feel like some of the
see what works. See what doesn't.
And I feel like some of the rub with the tools as well is that it takes a when I use this word, a cross-functional team, right, to make that happen. I mean, we kind of talk about wearing different hats, and some people can wear all the hats, but even in smaller organizations, there is some divide, and you're going to have to kind of share that workload. I think where we run into some heartburn is that not a single person is going to know all those tools or be able to do all of those steps for the analytics. And I think maybe that's the way sometimes, at least on the administrator side, we tend to balk at it a bit.
I agree. I mean, I think a lot of the DBAs I've talked to, they want to, it's not just DBAs, it's any programmer at all, will try to say, oh, I do this. I'm good. I know what I'm doing. I can do it all. You start doing it all. You start doing, especially in the data analysis world, you really can't. There is so much stuff out there. You may have a tool that can do the job, but it may not be the best tool, but you can do it, and you can get around to it. So you still, like, just with SQL, you have to have friends out there who know different areas who can help you with whatnot. That's one of the things you have to, sometimes you will get shown that you don't know it all. It's time to talk with friends who know this area. Just try talking out with them. Sometimes that's the best help.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. And on the different tools there, I mean, I kind of look at it as like the tools that somebody might have in their toolbox. You've got maybe maybe you've got a hammer and a drill and a screwdriver, and Excel and Power BI is the right tool to do another job. I mean, you use a screwdriver to screw in a screw. You could probably get that same screw screwed in with a hammer, or at least hammered in, but it might not be the best way of doing it. And I think sometimes with Excel versus Power BI or the other tools, it's kind of the same kind of comparison where you might be able to do something really quick in Excel that might take you more time in Power BI or vice versa. I think
right.
A lot of it depends on
the setup. The setup will take forever in Power BI or SQL Server, where in Excel you're already there. Just sit there and be done with it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's a lot of the business users out there who may not have that SQL Server experience, but if they can pull the data into Excel, then they can use it in an area that's comfortable for them.
And not even bother with the IT department, which, as we all know, we have 30,000 things going on. One thing that the user can do would be helpful.
Yep.
That's a very good point.
Would be helpful.
Yep.
That's a very good point.
Okay, so I guess last thoughts, or as we kind of wrap this up?
I just want to encourage more people to actually play with different tools that are available. Don't just, hey, let's play with SQL Server. We can do it all in SQL Server. Now you have 30,000 tools out there, not just what is normally set up for the IT, but you have Excel, you have a lot of open source things out there that you can get and use that use SQL Server or Bing to get better. And they're great tools. A lot of people have put a lot of time into some of this, and some of them may be quicker than your regular tools that you'll normally go for. I mean, even at worst, you'll learn something new about yourself, or you'll learn something new about yourself or about the tool and what scenarios it can be used and what it shouldn't be used for.
Some of that, I think, though, has to come from a business culture perspective, because I think, like you mentioned, the business users are going to bring us an Excel file, or they're going to bring us some handmade report, if you will, right, that came from who knows where, and they're going to be like, I want this. And so I think part of that is maybe a little interpersonal or personal relationship skills to say, you know what, let's talk about this. Let's see if we can't play with this other tool or look at this in a slightly different way to get where we need to go.
Right. In that case, you really have to work with your business team. If sometimes I have worked with teams who this is how it's always been and this is how it will always be. I need it copied over to SSRS. I want a report every day. I want a report every day at such and such time. Do not talk to me about any other things. This is what I want. This is what I need. End of story.
Right.
And then there's the ones you can work with.
And there is an advantage to at least having the users know what they want.
Yes, and know how to get there. That's great help to all of us.
Right. Okay, should we do SQL Family?
Yes.
I like it.
So, Kevin, how do you go about keeping up with technology and all the changes that are happening, especially in the SQL Server area?
I read lots of blogs. I have a old school. I do a RSS feed. Do lots of those. I listen to lots of webcasts. But my favorite is just SQL Server user groups. I learned probably more through those than I think of to get all the information that I could ever want. Plus, it just lets me see friends that I haven't seen in quite some time. The user groups are the number one way of getting data. It's everything.
If you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be?
All right, this is where the DBA side of me comes out. The auto-close feature is one of the dumbest things I've ever seen out there on SQL Server. And so many of the brand new DBAs will try to say, oh, let's just hit that and we'll be fine. We won't ever have to use the database again. Oh, my God, it'll drive me insane when I start looking through the logs and I start seeing closed connection. What? Stop! No, let's just get rid of that feature once and for all. Don't want to see it at all. I'm not even seeing why it's even there.
Good point. Okay, so can you tell us about the best piece of career advice that you've ever received?
This one is from my wife, who listens to this podcast along with me every week. She actually said early on when we were even starting dating, she told me that no matter what happens, as long as the systems are still running and you're just doing performance tuning, it'll all still be there in the morning. Because like all SQL developers, well, all developers, period, we try to get 2 or 3 more seconds faster for all of our stored procedures. It can wait. Don't just stay in the office until 9 or even your own work at home office. Don't stay down there until midnight or 2 in the morning. See your kids, see your family, see somebody. Don't just stay in the office and work yourself to death. Get out.
Right.
You know, that's a really great point. And I think that when people do get out or have something else outside of just their work life, they end up doing a much better job in the time that they were there doing their job. So,
Amen.
yeah, very good point.
Our last question for you today, Kevin. If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
Teleportation. Yep, I know y'all have been lately talking about, I want to be able to fly. Oh, heck no. I'm going to be oh, heck no. I'm going to be teleporting because I'm going to be there now. So flying toward there, heck with it. I want to teleport.
I like that.
There you go. Well, Kevin, thanks so much for being on the show with us today.
Oh, thank y'all. That was great. Had a great time.
Yeah, we do appreciate it. You taking a little time with us. So Kevin has a very down-to-earth style. One thing that I really liked about him. And I think he's doing some pretty neat things over there. But again, I won't say low key. He obviously has some deep experience in some of these different areas. But again, he's not letting the tools get in the way of making forward progress.
You know, that's a really good point. And I mean, it comes back to time and time again, just because there's a salesman out there pushing some new tool, it doesn't always mean it's going to be the best tool for your environment. I ran across an example recently where I was trying to come up with a solution around Power, but something easier and simpler. And they said, can we just have a query that runs from Excel? And that was what the executive at the company I was working for wanted. So, hey, that's what they're going to get. And it meets their needs and it gives them exactly what they're looking for without any complex overhead.
No, exactly. And I think particularly as we look to move outside of, I'll say the core data team even, we will want to use tools that those people are familiar with. And if you give that, that great example. I don't want to learn this new tool. I just want something that will meet my needs. And I think those tools are really right in front of us.
Yep, absolutely.
So of course, compañeros, we're interested in finding out what tools you're using and getting some of that feedback. Today's episode will be available at SQLDataPartners.com/BI tools. No spaces, BI tool. Put up the show notes and other things about Kevin up on that page. And we, of course, would love to get that feedback. I think that's going to do it for today's episode. You can reach out to us if you have other podcast ideas or suggestions. On Twitter, I am at Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am at SQL EMT. And don't forget to use the SQL podcast hashtag if you want to send something as well.
There we go. Another great option. Okay, well, another great episode. Thanks again for tuning in, compañeros, and we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.